Then Paul spoke. Ah, nuclear disarmament! Ah, save the rainforest! Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. I had crossed paths with Paul Wellstone before, but the first time I really encountered him was at the DFL State Convention in June of 1982. For the previous year and a half, I had been campaigning for the party's endorsement for the U.S. Senate seat held by incumbent Republican Senator Dave Dernberger. And I was basically unopposed for the endorsement at that convention. For the last 6 of those months, DFL events were also attended by a very earnest young man who wanted the endorsement to run against a well-entrenched Republican State Auditor, Arne Carlson. He too was unopposed for endorsement until the first morning of that 3-day convention, when a young activist named Paul Wellstone announced his candidacy for State Auditor. By the last morning, after 2 days of long endorsement battles and 2 nights of very late parties, delegates were exhausted, hungover, and ready to either head home or find the nearest bar. At last, only the endorsement for State Auditor stood between the delegates and the doors. The 2 candidates addressed the convention. The very earnest young man spoke first and gave a very earnest description of the State Auditor's responsibilities, reminding everyone that the definition of an auditor is a bank teller without the charisma. Then Paul spoke. Ah, nuclear disarmament! Ah, save the rainforest! Ah, social and economic justice! The convention went wild. The fact that the issues Paul raised had nothing to do with the job of State Auditor mattered nothing to DFLers, who had just heard the most electrifying speech of their lives. A motion was made for a voice vote on the endorsement, and Paul won overwhelmingly. So he and I spent a lot of time together on the campaign trail for the next 5 months. Unfortunately, Minnesota voters were not quite as taken with our candidacies as were DFL delegates. Fortunately, however, Rudy Perpich was elected governor that year, avenging his defeat 4 years before. He appointed me the commissioner of the Minnesota Department of Energy and Economic Development. And a few months later, he asked Paul to become his senior advisor on energy policy. Paul worked out of our Deed headquarters in an office we created for him next to my terrific deputy, Connie Lewis, and myself. Late afternoons, we put our feet up on somebody's desk and solved the problems of the world. That's where Paul and I became real friends. We discovered that despite our different backgrounds, we agreed on most issues, and we both wanted another chance to be elected and to make a difference. So in 1990, we switched strategies. Paul ran for the U.S. Senate, and I ran for State Auditor. Paul proceeded, as you know, to pull off the most extraordinary, unbelievable upset anywhere in my political lifetime. He defeated a very well-funded Republican incumbent, Rudy Boschwitz. Trailing by over 40 points in polls less than 2 months before the election, Paul steadily won the hearts, minds, and votes of more and more and more Minnesotans. Yet despite a terrific campaign with a phenomenal candidate, he entered the final weekend before the election trailing by several points in published polls. And Boschwitz had just launched a vicious, very personal attack on Paul and his family. The faces of Paul, Sheila, and their daughter Marcia were grim as our DFL ticket boarded a bus for our final statewide tour. Now I should say this was not the green bus. This was a bus that got more than 5 miles a gallon and didn't break down every hour. It was a tense time. Paul was outraged at Boschwitz's despicable attack and frustrated that his campaign had no money to match his opponent's closing media blitz. What followed was a most amazing ending to this most incredible campaign. At our bus stops, Paul began receiving reports that Boswitz's tactics were backfiring. Minnesotans were deeply offended. Then Vice President Mondale stepped forward and condemned the attack as un-Minnesotan. 2 days later, the voters agreed, and Paul won election to the United States Senate in the most unlikely, unbelievable, and unforgettable upset anyone could remember. Something else important happened on that election night. Minnesotans' decisive rejection of his opponent's tactics and their enthusiastic embrace of Paul gave him faith in Minnesota voters' sound values and good judgment that he would rely upon throughout his Senate career. This faith enabled him to take principled positions because he knew they were right, not because he thought they might be popular. That special bond between Paul and the people he represented was unbreakable through the end of his career and his life. It continues to this day and will beyond. For the next 10 years, I knew, as did everyone who shared Paul's vision for a new and better world, that he was an outstanding United States Senator and a rising national leader. But it was not until Paul and I shared his last 2 years in the Senate that I fully appreciated his importance and his influence. Paul was known as the conscience of the Senate, when most of the Senate preferred to act without one. He was always principled, always courageous, always eloquent, and therefore usually in the minority. That minority, however, defined what the Senate wasn't, just as it also defined who Paul was. He was, hands down, the Senate's best orator, probably one of the greatest of all time. Despite his seniority, he had chosen a desk located in the back row of the chamber and right next to an aisle. Its microphone had an unusually long cord, which had been installed by the Senate's previous oratorical star, Dale Bunkers. That combination gave Paul the freedom to move around and to fully express himself when he spoke. Now, much of a senator's effectiveness depends upon his or her powers of persuasion. The words spoken in the Senate chamber before colleagues and on average over 1 million C-SPAN viewers are principal means of that persuasion. No one was more persuasive on the Senate floor than Paul. In addition, he was well liked and respected by his fellow senators, even the ones who usually disagreed with him, of whom there were a few. In Minnesota, Paul's political stature grew ever taller, and his light shone brighter and brighter. Someone once said of an abrasive Minnesota politician, quote, "Before you meet him, you instinctively dislike him. But after you really get to know him, you detest him." With Paul, the opposite occurred. The more Minnesotans got to know him, the better they liked him. Who else could have said, quote, "I'm here to represent the little fellers, not the Rockefellers," and yet receive steadfast support from Minnesota's only member of that family. And several of her relatives around the country. Who else could have persuaded my father and my uncle, two staunch Republican businessmen, to vote for Paul in 1996 instead of a fellow Republican businessman? Oh, I don't even know if they ever voted for me. Both said, quote, in essence, "I don't always agree with him, but I trust that he's always standing up for what he believes is right." Possessed with such unusual political courage, Paul was often frustrated with other politicians who lacked it. One afternoon, I found him on the Senate floor fuming. Now, when Paul was fuming, it was visible from the distance of about a mile, which at least gave you time to brace yourself. One of our Democratic colleagues had just informed him that she would not support his latest amendment. She reportedly said, quote, I'd like to help you, Paul, but that's a tough vote for me." Paul was livid. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" he asked me rhetorically. "To say I'll be with you on the easy votes, but not on the tough ones?" There was no place in political cowardice with Paul. From those courageous battles, Paul's reputation as a remarkable progressive leader grew nationwide. People throughout the country were urging him to run for president. Had he lived? Who knows? I personally believe, without any evidence, that he would have felt duty-bound to try. And I have no doubt that he would have been a far better presidential candidate in 2004 than the Democratic senator who won the nomination and lost only narrowly to President Bush. But Paul did not achieve and sustain this stratospheric success all by himself. He had terrific support from a very talented and dedicated staff, led in Minnesota first by Jeff Blodgett, who had also masterminded his winning campaign. And then by Connie Lewis. He had, in Washington, Kari Moe, another former student of Paul's at Carleton, was his chief of staff. I used to kid Paul that his real purpose in being a Carleton College professor was not imparting knowledge to his students as much as identifying the best of them to recruit for his future campaigns and staffs. Kari is now the Washington Chief of Staff for Representative Keith Ellison. Jeff is now running the Obama campaign in Minnesota. Connie's a senior officer with Planned Parenthood, Minnesota. As evidence that the people Paul inspired were deeply, deeply committed, not only to him, but also to the beliefs that they shared with him. And they have carried on remarkably well. His most important support was his family. At a time when every conservative politician talked incessantly about family values, Paul and his family lived them. Sheila and he were married for 33 years before passing on. He adored his three children, Dave, Marcia, and Mark. He was enormously proud of them and their accomplishments. Any contact with one of them, even a brief phone call, noticeably buoyed his spirits. Then, of course, there was Sheila, the family's rock of Gibraltar, Paul's best friend and closest confidant, the person everyone turned to in a crisis, be it personal or political. Paul and Sheila's devotion to each other, to their children, and to their entire family was exceptional for anyone, and exceptionally rare for a political couple. Amazingly, the trials and tribulations of 3 intense Senate campaigns and 12 years in the cauldron of Washington, D.C. brought them closer together, not farther apart. The ultimate test of Paul's political courage and the final measure of his special standing with Minnesotans occurred just days before his death, during the Senate's vote on President Bush's Iraq War resolution. The President was demanding that Congress surrender to him its exclusive authority under the Constitution to commit our nation to war. The resolution gave him carte blanche to do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted to do it. The political pressures were intense. Polls showed that large majorities of Minnesotans and other Americans supported the President because they believed, mistakenly as it turned out, that they could trust him. Those pressures fell especially hard on the senators running for re-election and facing their election day just 2 weeks after the vote. Washington wisdom said that any senator who voted against the war resolution was assured of defeat. At the time, polls showed Paul running neck and neck with his opponent, who, of course, had promised to support the President. Just days before the climactic vote, which Senator Robert Byrd said later was the most important of the 17,000 votes he cast in the Senate, a harsh news story appeared. It quoted anonymous sources who claimed that the Senate's Democratic leaders were trying to shelter Paul from a very hard and possibly even fatal decision. We happened to have a Democratic caucus meeting that afternoon where Paul was as angry as I've ever seen him. He was furious that unnamed political enemies were questioning his honesty and his integrity. Quote, "If the people of Minnesota know anything about me," he told our caucus, "it's that I don't duck the tough issues. I always stand up for what I believe in, that I always do what I think is right, regardless of whether it's popular in the moment or not." With that, he walked out of the Senate floor and gave one of his greatest speeches, explaining to Minnesotans and other Americans why he would vote against the Iraq War resolution. He was one of 23 senators who did so. Shortly after that vote, I saw Paul for the last time. The Senate had just adjourned until after the upcoming elections. Paul, of course, was headed home to campaign in Minnesota. I was leaving on a week-long trip to visit NATO bases in Europe. I assured him, however, that I would return to Minnesota in time to join him and his family on the final weekend's bus tour, which had become a shared tradition in our campaigns. Paul looked more upbeat and relaxed than I had seen him in a very long time. He told me he had just received the results of the first poll taken after the Iraq War vote. He had jumped ahead by 6 points. He was ecstatic. Not only was he then confident that he would win re-election, but his faith in Minnesotans was reaffirmed. He had their support. The bond was unbroken. There's no consolation for me in what followed, except for my belief that Paul boarded the plane that fateful morning, knowing that he would be re-elected to the United States Senate. I'd like to close with a story which took place just a few weeks before that terrible disaster. It was a Monday afternoon in September of 2002. The Senate was not in session that day, so the chamber was empty, except for a few staff, when I happened to walk into it. There I came upon Paul and Marcia's young son, Josh. They were on a grandpa-grandson outing. Because the Senate was adjourned, Paul could take Josh onto the floor where I joined them. "Here's Grandpa's desk," Paul said to Josh. "Here's where Ted Kennedy sits." Josh interrupted. Plaintively, he asked, "Grandpa, I thought you said we were going somewhere." His father looked at him even more plaintively and replied, "Well, this is somewhere." Josh was too young to understand then, but the United States Senate surely is somewhere. And his grandfather was there, a greatly respected, highly effective United States Senator and a rising national leader. I don't know whether Paul, when he was young, ever imagined he might attain such a pinnacle of political success. I doubt that anyone else did. To reach this somewhere, he overcame odds as monumental as winning a national lottery. He succeeded, however, not by luck, but rather through his own political brilliance, his tireless determination, and his ability to make very special connections with many, many people. Paul stood out in the Senate. He was more like senators from earlier eras who attained the offices by the scope of their accomplishments, not the size of their campaign accounts. He was more talented, eloquent, politically astute, and principled than most of his colleagues, too many of whom wanted to be in the Senate for what it could do for them. Paul wanted to be in the Senate for what he could do for others. And people got it. They came to understand that profound difference, to appreciate what a difference it made in their lives, and to realize how extraordinary it was that by some miracle, someone had been elected to the United States Senate who was using that office for them. You were right, Paul. You sure did get somewhere. Somewhere extraordinary. And you did so much there to better your state, your country, and your world. And you would have done so much more if only you'd been given the chance. But life can be truly unfair. To you it was terribly, terribly unfair. A decade later, we still mourn your loss, for you are irreplaceable as a politician, as a parent, and as a friend. We also mourn the losses of Sheila, Marcia, Mary, Tom, and Will, such wonderful people, so cruelly taken away from us. We mourn all of you tonight and every night. Rest in peace, Paul. No, come to think of it, cause a ruckus up there. Start a stage a march or maybe a boycott. But tell the supreme powers that we need some reinforcements down here. You taught us well, and we're doing our best to carry on the torch that you carried so far and so well. But unfortunately, none of us are you.